The following is a public preview of the New Models podcast. For our complete library, visit patreon.com/newmodels or newmodels.substack.com.
You're now listening to New Models.
Welcome to New Models. In this episode, we're joined once again by journalist and essayist James Pogue. When we last spoke to him in the fall of 2022, his Vanity Fair article, Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets, had just gone viral. The article brought broader public awareness to a rising, loosely connected web of Catholic conservatives, traditionalists, post-leftists, and neo-reactionaries, and included interviews with J.D. Vance, Curtis Yarvin, and Honor Levy. 2 years later, one of these figures is the probable next vice president of the United States, and unfortunately, it is not Honor Levy. Pogue is a rare 20th century style long-form journalist with a capital J. He's written for Harper's and The Baffler, but also American Conservative, and the trust he's earned over the years doing embedded literary journalism grants him access that very few have. He remains in conversation with influential and controversial figures across the political spectrum, and he recently spent time in the Sahel penning a series of essays for Granta magazine, with support from the Pulitzer Center. Beneath its intimate first-person perspective, Pogue's writing often captures the rumblings of seismic shifts on national and global scales. When we recorded with Pogue earlier this month, Donald Trump hadn't yet been almost assassinated, and J.D. Vance hadn't yet been publicly named Trump's running mate. In our conversation, these things come up as possibilities, but too wild to actually happen. As we enter a third round of disliked establishment Democrat versus Trump, however, it looks like a new map, if not a new game entirely, has been loaded. And so, particularly for the left, this will require entirely new considerations, new rules, and new goals. Imagining 2024 as a continuation or a reprise of disliked establishment Democrat versus Trump 2016 or disliked establishment Democrat versus Trump 2020 is a non-starter. Because despite the dizzying speed of technological advances over the past few years, it feels like many of us have been too reluctant, too entangled in mediatized political metagames, or just too overwhelmed and distracted to realize how far the new right has evolved over the same period. At New Models, we mostly stay away from political discussion because, quite simply, the last thing anyone needs is another podcast featuring non-experts sharing their political opinions. But we're invested in how systems work and how media wires those systems, and there may be no one better able to tell the story of America's on-the-ground political conditions, and further how that vision of America sits within a wider international scope than James Pogue. As our Really Real summer continues, we are very excited to bring you another episode that will make your head spin. I'm Lil Internet, joined by my co-host Carly Busta. Our guest is James Pogue. Let's get into it.
On this episode, we are joined by returning guest, so proud to say that, journalist James Pogue.
How are you doing?
He's written extensively on instances of what we might call the right to self-determination, particularly in America. His 2018 book, Chosen Country, tells the story of the Bundy Ranch standoff, where an enclave of Nevada ranchers denied the authority of the federal government in determining local land use laws, and subsequently seized the headquarters of a national wildlife refuge, occupying it for 40 days with an armed militia. When we last talked with James in the fall of 2022, he was working on a piece for Vanity Fair on the idea of exit, held by many among the tech elite, and specifically those who imagine the U.S. Northern Rockies as a key refuge for weathering the so-called managed decline of post-boom America. Pogue is a former fact checker for GQ, which in the parlance of legacy media is the equivalent of being a Navy SEAL, and is, let's say, relatively familiar with Americans' freight train infrastructure. This spring, he published a piece in Granta supported by the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. The story was, as I understand, supposed to be about small-time
artisanal
gold mining in the Central African Republic. But due to the information economy on the ground there, it followed a different path. The lead image for the piece features an African man in a black t-shirt with some, you probably know who it is, but an Angel Militia gaming figure thing, and the copy under it, Je suis Wagner. So we had the idea to call him and see if he'd get on the pod again after watching Alex Garland's Civil War, which came out this spring. We happened to see it with Trevor Paglen and his partner, and it brought up all these thoughts about America and psyops and sort of the sentiment of America. But it was actually Ellie Holbrook, who is an LNG specialist who's in the New Model sphere and also like a Russia-phile, who was like, hey, James Pogue just dropped this amazing piece in Granta on Wagner in the CAR. You've got to read it. And we happen to be, I mean, this is so gossipy, but I feel like it sort of sets the stage. We're actually at a studio party at Trevor's studio, like I.L. Weissman was like next to us. Ellie's talking about it, and we're like, oh yeah,
That's
James
funny.
Pogue's Granta piece. So I felt like, the last time we spoke to you, this
Of course,
theme
Trevor
of,
Paglen, all of his recent art is about psyops and
Totally.
Right.
UFO government conspiracies being planted by government agents.
Yeah, like we watched this film that was animating these sentiments. Then it was like Coachella, and we were watching Lana Del Rey on the back of these motorcycles. And we were thinking like, maybe it'll be really interesting to ask James like where America's head is right now.
It's like dreams.
And it's dreams, right.
Yeah.
And like last
Right.
time we talked to you, Civil War came up. You were working on this Vanity Fair piece and thinking about groups seceding and these libertarian ideas of exit, and just wondered, like, what are you seeing in all this? And also objectively, now you spent this 8 months in that middle of the sort of rogue region of Africa. Like, how does all this now appear? Just this like shift in perspective. For a long time, America has functioned under this mythology of democracy, and that justified a lot of like brutal activity overseas. But maybe that's breaking down. And what do you see filling that void?
Well, okay. So first of all, shout out to Ellie, because she knows a lot more about Russia and certain aspects of resource infrastructure and stuff like that. If she's liking the Granta stuff, that's a cool note. So in answer to the big question, the funny thing for me as a journalist is like, I'm what my agent calls a very permeable person, which is kind of helpful for the work. Like I get swept away with like things that I'm perceiving in other people, and I'm very excitable. It's not good if you want to be a monk or a businessman, but it can be helpful if you want to be a journalist. This is a long way of saying that there's this kind of funny shift that one seems to perceive in the smart person zeitgeist, where it went from like, America's divided, America's facing rupture between our grand politico-cultural tribes of conservatives and liberals or urbanites and rural and whatever you want to talk about it, to like this kind of more systemic thing. Like it's become really, really common now to think of America in terms of like imperial histories and like the rise and falls of empires, right? Rather than like, wait, what was the impending crisis that led to our 1865 Civil War and how does this look like now? It's more like, what happens when empires fall and like, what are the systemic issues surrounding that? And there's a natural reason for that, I think. When I first got into this game of describing the imperial decline, it was before Russia invaded Ukraine. And even after those couple of Vanity Fair pieces that came out that were pretty big, like came into the public and were sort of describing the system in ways that people hadn't quite talked about in mainstream politics yet. Like, even though everybody on Twitter already knew all the stuff I was talking about. At the time, like you didn't see the limits of the American system yet. You didn't see that the sanctions weren't going to work. You didn't see this conversation yet about like, oh, like maybe everyone will just stop using the dollar as a global reserve currency. Like stuff like this, where you have to like actually sit down and look at the financial pipelines of like how dollars are exported from the American financial system through the euro dollar system to then be like acquired on capital markets. So like people can get resources to build a building in France or something. Like this was stuff that people weren't thinking about. And candidly, I wasn't thinking about. And so I kind of went from this, oh my God, America's falling apart. I like America. I've sort of lived a lot in its what you might call underbelly. And I kind of like that. And I kind of like the place and I'm concerned about where it goes, to thinking like, wait, if you don't understand the Eurodollar system, you're actually not going to understand why it's breaking down. And that sent me to Africa essentially, but it also sent me like on a lot of intellectual journeys that I didn't really ever expect. I never expected to have to care as much as I do now about macroeconomics. But I do think that there's been a shift there. And I think those of us who are cursed or blessed to be inside of these bird's eye conversations about statecraft and how you organize societies and all this stuff, like that's where it's all headed. And it's been very rapid because we just live in a time of very rapid shifts.
And what do you think's accelerated that? I mean, obviously like the internet, but at the same time, there's also been a lot of fragmentation over the past few years in terms of like information systems. So what in your mind has driven that shift in scope?
Well, I think part of it actually isn't that the conversation, is per se overheated in the way that, like, for example, we're talking on a day after the first American presidential debate. And, it's sort of impossible to say what's going to happen at this time because last night at 1 a.m., everything I was getting was like, the Rubicon's been crossed. It's the end of America. Like, here we go. Like, and I'm going to the Democratic National Convention. Sorry for the digression, but this year I was given the option of, do I go to the Republican National Convention or the Democratic National Convention? And naturally one tends to kind of pick the RNC because it's like, it's crazy. And it's like, people, that's what people click on. They want to see what's happening. What are the Republicans doing? And I kind of made a long shot bet, like, no, the DNC is going to be the one that's crazy. And it's going to be in Chicago after everything that happened in Chicago back in the day. And now all of a sudden it might actually be an open convention. This is a digression to say like, okay, so American politics are crazy overheated. But actually, in terms of the foreign stuff that has really jumped into what I would say is probably the fore of a lot of our conversations about the direction, not just of America, but of the West, and probably even more so for you guys in Europe. Like, the foreign policy stuff is happening like at an absolutely astonishing rate.
Totally.
And so like, not to make this conversation per se about my time in Africa, but there were 8 coups or something in Francophone Africa in the space of 2 years. And like people are like, oh, it's Africa, there's always a coup. That's not normal. That's not a normal situation.
The entire band of Africa too, like specifically this band of Africa from east to west below the Sahara, right? The full Sahel region. The Sahel. More or less.
Yeah.
It's like a geographical latitudinal wall of coups.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. My next Granta piece is coming out in the next issue, and that's about being in Mauritania, where I used to live. And I have all these like really writerly descriptions, like what the Sahel is. It's like,
you used to live in Mauritania?
Yeah, like I need to
Sorry. Okay. This fits into our conversation. So we'll go from here. So I dropped out and I was riding freight trains around America. I had been at McGill, so I spoke French. My girlfriend's like very embarrassed to hear me talk because it's very like Canadien. So I spoke French, and then I had these street smarts because I was like riding freight trains around America for a while, and like that's dangerous and stuff. And so I got a job looking for gold. Like, I'm getting ahead of myself. I got a job essentially like helping this crew of people who were doing geophysical exploration. I didn't know what we were looking for because when you do geophysical exploration, you're just making subsurface maps of differences in like the gravitational force of a certain block of Earth, the magnetic force of a certain block of Earth. And then you can kind of guess like, oh, there's iron, there might be gold, there might be water or whatever, right? So I was doing that. And then I became by accident sort of the crew chief because nobody else wanted to do it. So like my 21-year-old year was spent like running this project in Africa that turned out to be looking essentially for gold, because all across this Sahelian band that you describe, people all know this like cliche of like Mansa Musa, the Malian king who was the richest man who ever lived. So there was like gold there, but nobody really knew how much or like how easy it would be to find. And so in the space of like basically the time since I left, all of this entire continent-wide semi-arid band that separates the vast Sahara from wet, moist equatorial Africa, there's like 10 million people now working as small-time miners in a very sparsely populated area. It's been one of the most significant gold rushes in human history. And it kind of becomes this frontier edge of empire metaphor in a certain way, because the big story of the Russian involvement there and the collapse of the French sphere of influence in these Francophone countries in the Sahel is essentially that Russia is coming in and getting paid by gold that their guys take with guns. And that's just like not something that's supposed to fit into our imperial system. There used to be a Western security umbrella that would prevent stuff like that from happening. And that's kind of going away.
I did not expect that, but that's absolutely fascinating and fits into a very fuzzy conspiratorial.
Well, I was just going to link quickly to when you're talking about the euro dollar system. What I wasn't expecting, and I thought about it for the first time in your Granta piece, I think there's some reference to this, is, that's being bypassed by gold. So it's like an open bank, and it's just like you don't need the dollar or euro if you have direct access to gold.
That's completely true. The next Granta piece is actually like playing on exactly this theme of like, I'm an American who likes certain American things, our history of the frontier and resource work and blah, blah, blah. And so it's sort of this story of like, as an American going back to what is literally a frontier zone at the edge of whatever these spheres of empire are. And you're seeing sort of like the frontier reemerge, right? And in these portions of Africa, there's a book that is very much alive in people's historical understanding called the Mukaddima, which is a study of empire by this guy, Ibn Khaldun, who was Tunisian and studied empires as a course of history in which you cycle between decadent elites that take the center. He always talks about them eating rich foods. They get weak by eating rich foods. And then you have the Bedouin or whatever, the nomads who are getting strong, who develop, there's an Arabic term for it, but in the translation I have, it's called group feeling. You develop this sense of force of will and group feeling, and you come in and take the center, and then the cycle repeats, right? This is like, it's a study of history that is not one of never-ending progress, the one that we probably grew up with, but one of sort of cyclical waves of in and out, right? So it's funny to go back and then you're like, I'm experiencing one of these waves. And to the very specific point you're making, yes, there's a reason gold is a frontier resource. It's like it's easily converted into international markets. It's easily moved. Like it's just very dense for the value of the product. So you can put it in a suitcase and that suitcase is worth millions of dollars. And we can go into this. We can have a whole conversation about the frontier gold business because it's really complicated. And I spent many months in it just now. So it flows from all across the region, largely to Bamako, where they make it into rough bricks. They have these little artisanal refineries all over town. And then now there's a direct daily flight from Bamako to Dubai, where it all ends up.
I was going to say Dubai, the UAE.
Yeah.
When we went to Dubai last year, it was really apparent to us how the UAE really was a new center. Singapore, Dubai,
For sure.
and gold was...
Dubai is like the Switzerland for a multipolar world or something.
Yeah. And you know what? Switzerland and London, who are historically the sort of main gold refining centers, are really mad about Dubai capitalizing on this African gold trade because there's a lot of suitcase gold going to Dubai. And this is the classic question in terms of foreign policy that we're dealing with right now is like, how much of the standing up for like norms, human rights, doing things the right way, this kind of thing, how much of that is, hey, like Dubai is getting a lot of traffic gold that goes to fund jihadist groups, terrorists, drug smugglers, all kinds of bad stuff. So we want to put a stop to this. They should have more stringent controls. And how much of it is Switzerland and London being like, we're losing the business.
Yeah.
And like, this is always this kind of classic tension in like the questions of the American empire. How much was it ever about human rights and democracy and blah, blah, blah. So you can see all this stuff like really playing out in very vivid conversations now in a way that probably they did during the Cold War as well. But that kind of like took a back seat for a long time during the age of the end of history.
So this does, validate or gives a bit more rigor to this new binary I've been thinking about where the United States, it has this Marvel superhero-sized tech industry, and it's this industry of this purely abstract layer, right? Mm-hmm. And you have a market totally detached from material reality, all of this money in synthetic derivatives. The entire machine is just spun off into a realm of pure abstraction. The main industry of America now is producing infrastructure of pure abstraction. And then I think about the other pole of the world that's kind of ascendant, which ironically, is bricks. Like, makes you think of something hard and material.
Right.
But you can imagine this other pole putting a ton of energy and effort into mining massive amounts of the historical, traditional, like material currency. I mean, do you think that is an aspect of these two poles? One is kind of doubling down on the material world, like China, it's like 10 times the steel production of the United States at this point. Like industry, raw materials, gold, while America is kind of 10x leveraged on a dream that artificial generative intelligence, this abstract in the cloud super intelligence, will somehow enable it to maintain its position as like the hegemonic power of the planet.
Yeah, so this is a great question. This is where this all kind of comes together. When I was talking earlier about...
If you're hearing this message, you've completed the first step towards becoming a New Models member. To continue, visit patreon.com/newmodels or newmodels.substack.com. A complete library containing hundreds of rare New Models episodes awaits.